If we were to compare the kingdom of God to anything, surely the kingdom of God is like a black walnut tree. Just imagine the trees in St. John's churchyard. They tower over their surroundings. They can live more than 100 years. They provide a home for squirrels, and birds of all kinds nest in its branches. Those trees can defend themselves. As many of us know, once the nuts begin falling, you can slip on one and break an ankle, or they might whack you on the head. The roots of walnut trees contain a chemical that poisons some other plants. Tomatoes, peppers, pine trees, lilacs, and birches will die if they're planted too close to walnuts. These trees make sure nothing else can threaten their food supply. A black walnut tree is majestic, strong, enduring. Surely that is what the kingdom of God is like. But the kingdom of God is more like a dandelion. For a flower with such a bright color, it is reviled. It's one of the most invasive plants there is. It gets in where it isn't wanted and it takes over. But its nectar gives food for bees and butterflies, especially early in the spring when not much else is flowering. The entire dandelion is edible, though it's bitter. You can put it in a salad. French cooks will blanch the leaves to remove some of the bite. A dandelion is vulnerable. A curious toddler or a lawnmower can rip the head off the flower, yet it's persistent in its own way. Dandelions have a deep taproot. You have to rip it out by the root or it will continue to grow and spread, blowing its fluffy seeds far from the original plant. How many times have you seen a dandelion in the middle of an immaculate stretch of grass and wondered, how did that get there? If Jesus had taught in North America instead of the Middle East, he might have said that the kingdom of God is like a dandelion. Walnut trees and dandelions are the closest equivalents I can think of to cedar trees and mustard plants. Cedar trees are native to Jesus' part of the world. They grow in the mountains of Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. They appear several times in the Bible. King Solomon used cedar wood for the walls, roof, and altar of the temple in Jerusalem, and also for his palace. Perhaps because of this, cedar trees became a symbol of the kings of Israel. The line descended from Solomon and his father, King David. This tree is worthy of a king's palace, worthy of God's house. Hundreds of years after David's time, after his kingdom had split into two, the northern half Israel had been conquered by Assyria, and the southern half Judah was losing its war against Babylon. At that time, the prophet Ezekiel spoke of cedar trees. This is a complicated allegory that's probably unfamiliar to us, so bear with me while I outline it. Ezekiel described the royal house of David as a towering cedar, and the Babylonian Empire as a great eagle, a bird of prey. The eagle, the Babylonians, plucked the topmost shoot of the cedar, David's descendant King Zedekiah, and planted it in a city of merchants, Babylon. Then the eagle planted a seed, Zedekiah's nephew Jehoiachin, in fertile soil, Jerusalem. The seed grew into a vine, and the vine stretched out its branches toward another eagle, Egypt, that tried to transplant the vine. Let me unallegorize that. The Babylonian Empire took Judah's king Zedekiah captive and put him in exile in Babylon, along with most of Judah's leadership, including Ezekiel. The Babylonians installed Zedekiah's nephew Jehoiachin as a puppet king in Judah. But Jehoiachin began making overtures to Egypt, hoping to bring Egypt into war on Judah's side. Ezekiel is asking, do you really think this is going to work? You really think that another predatory empire is going to safeguard our land, our people? You might as well put a cedar tree in the custody of loggers. God's answer to this, according to Ezekiel, is that God will take a sprig from the top of a cedar. Forget the competing empires. God will step in and act. God will plant this sprig, this chosen leader, on the mountain height of Israel, in Ezekiel's own country, the one he has been forced to leave. The sprig will grow into a grand tree. It will bear seeds, and birds of many kinds will nest in its branches. In other words, God's chosen leader will make Judah thrive with life again. It's a message of hope for Ezekiel and the other exiles. Yes, their world is a mess right now. Their country is in ruins, and they don't know if they will ever see their homes again. But whatever humans and their empires do, God is ultimately sovereign, and God will break into this world with a dramatic flourish. Jesus knew the work of the Jewish prophets well. So did his disciples and all the first Christians. When the gospel writer Mark began writing down Jesus' words about 40 years after Jesus' lifetime, Mark must have had Ezekiel and his cedar trees in mind. Mark's world was a mess too. In his time, the Roman Empire ruled what is now called Israel and Palestine. And a few years before Mark started writing, the Jewish people rebelled against Rome. Rome was caught by surprise, and for a while, the Jewish army was winning. Then Rome sent in reinforcements. They put Jerusalem under siege, starved the city into surrender, then razed it and destroyed the temple. Mark wrote his gospel soon after the fall of Jerusalem, when it was becoming clear that the dream of an independent Israel was dead. Mark and his community were lost. They hadn't been exiled from their homes like Ezekiel, but the home of their faith, Jerusalem, was gone. They had suffered in the war, in the disease and famine that always came with war. They too wanted God to break into the world and make everything right, kick out the Romans, restore Jerusalem to its former glory. They wanted the strong, resolute cedar tree to be the kingdom of God. Instead, Jesus gives them the mustard seed. This is a joke. It's meant to be funny. Mustard is a weed. It doesn't take years to grow to maturity. It's ready to harvest in only 60 days. It's nothing like a shrub. Jesus is exaggerating. Mustard is a thin plant with a single stalk. Forget nesting in its branches. A bird landing on it would bend it to the ground. Yes, mustard is used in herbal medicine and it's edible, but mustard greens are so bitter that I can't eat them. Maybe you don't like them either. But the thing about mustard plants is that they're everywhere. When Melville and I went to the Holy Land, every place we went that had even a little green space had mustard growing in it. There were mustard plants at the edge of parking lots, in flower beds that weren't ruthlessly weeded, in parks, in fields where sheep and goats grazed. And somehow, the sight of all those bright yellow flowers was even more hopeful and life-giving than a majestic cedar tree. If the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, then the kingdom of God is all over the place. You can't keep it out. And you can't eradicate it without hard work and constant vigilance. Cut down the kingdom of God and it'll spring back up in a few weeks. And the kingdom of God is ordinary, in a good way. You don't have to climb the mountains of Israel to find it. It's growing in your backyard, in the cracks of the sidewalk. It's so common that you might pass by without seeing it. But once you notice its bright yellow flowers, you can't help noticing them everywhere. Both Ezekiel and Mark's community wanted God to do something big and bold to fix their problems. Maybe we want that too. But Jesus says that God is at work in smaller, more subtle ways all the time. What if God's activity in our lives is as everyday and ubiquitous as a mustard plant or a dandelion? What if instead of waiting for God to be as dramatic and strong as a walnut tree, we looked for God among the weeds? We might notice the kingdom of God everywhere, in all the corners of our world, as small and yet as pervasive as a dandelion.